Phillips and Josh Blackman today to discuss their recent article, Corpus Linguistics and Heller, which was published here at the Law Review just this month. Just as a quick introduction for both of them, starting with Professor Phillips. Professor Phillips attended the University of Arizona for his bachelor's and then BYU for his master's before going to Berkeley for both his PhD and his JD. After law school, he worked on the Utah Supreme Court and the DC Circuit, and then worked in private practice as well as the Becker Fund for Religious Liberty, and is now still does constitutional and appellate litigation, I think, somewhat as I understand it, and then also as a professor at Chapman too, and at Chapman Law School as well. And then Professor Blackman graduated from Penn State University, and then went on to George Mason, now the Antonin Scalia School of Law in Virginia. After law school, he clerked on the Western District of Pennsylvania, and then on the Sixth Circuit for Judge Boggs before starting as a professor at South Texas College of Law, where he has now become a national expert on the Constitution and has testified before, and testified before Congress repeatedly, including the last couple of impeachment trials. So it's our. And I should say this, as far as relevant to the article today, Professor Phillips was the one who designed, or was one of the key designers of the Pathia database you're going to hear a lot about in the coming minutes, which is kind of the underlying basis of the article and its application to the Heller decision. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Phillips and Professor Blackman.
All right, thank you so much. I'll go first and I'll give some background, then I'll hand over to James to do the hard part, which is usually how we divide our labor. No, I'm just kidding. We're actually very good friends, and we're really happy to be here. So first off, I'd like to thank the Wake Forest Law Review for selecting our article. You did a lot of work to make this article feasible, and we're really grateful for the time and effort that you put into it. We're also grateful to the Federalist Society and everyone at Wake Forest for hosting us today. So the topic here is Corpus Linguistics and Heller. Not corpus linguistics in the Second Amendment. And I want to make that distinction clear at the outset. What our job was in our paper was to assess the linguistic claims that were made in Heller. We were not trying to write a definitive treatment of the original public meaning of the Second Amendment. That couldn't be done in one article. It could not be done in one book. It would take a library to actually do. The reason why I think that distinction is important is our goal wasn't to assess whether Heller was right or wrong, although that's how people usually cite us for. Our goal is actually far more modest. We assessed the linguistic claims made by Justice Scalia's majority opinion and by Justice Stevens's dissenting opinion. We do not address the issues in McDonald v. Chicago about the incorporation of the Second Amendment. We don't even address the right of carry, concealed carry or open carry, which is at issue this term in the New York State rifle and pistol case. So our claim is very much backwards looking. How did Scalia and Stevens do with their arguments? Now, usually it's very complex to grade the accuracy of a complex decision. So we tried to use a tool that would let us evaluate how Stevens and Scalia wrote their opinions. And we turned to a tool called Corpus Linguistics. Now, Corpus Linguistics is not new, right? You've all used corpuses before. I'm sorry, corpora. You've all used corpora, which is the plural of corpus, before. You've used dictionaries. You've used Westlaw. You've used Google. You've used different sources that have lots of meanings in them. And that's a form of a corpus. But we have something a little bit more ambitious than Westlaw and Google. We have a database known as COFEA. It's spelled the acronym is COFEA, COFEA, which is the Corpus of Founding Era American English. Rhymes with Sophia to make it easy to remember. And COFEA contains over 100,000 texts of approximately 140 million words. And it spans a very precise span of time, from 1760 to 1799. Why those dates? Well, King George III began his reign in 1760. and George Washington died in 1799. So this is a very good chunk of the founding era that's captured here. And COFIA lets us parse the 27 words of the Second Amendment in ways that were simply not possible in 2008 when the court decided Heller. So I'll give you a few examples. In Heller, Justice Scalia and Stevens made linguistic claims about 4 elements of the Second Amendment. So first, right of the people. What's the meaning of that phrase? Second, keep and bear arms. Okay. Third, keep arms. And 4, bear arms. Right. So again, it's right of the people, keep and bear arms, keep arms, and bear arms. Those are the 4 linguistic claims that we sort of considered. And both the majority and the dissent use various textualist approaches to consider these 4 phrases, but their toolkit was limited. They only considered a fairly narrow subset of information to interpret that text. Justice Scalia basically admitted he didn't have that much to go on. He wrote in his opinion that his analysis was limited to, quote, written documents of the founding period that we have found. And again, candor, right? He admitted he didn't have that many. Justice Stevens also admitted he didn't have that much to go on. He said he studied dozens of contemporary texts, dozens. Well, we have 100,000 documents that we can query from and study from. Our analysis relied on several tools that are often used in corpus linguistics research. I think James will go more into depth, but I'll introduce these here just to get a high level. People often think that corpus linguistics is bean counting, to use a phrase I don't care much for, right? Where you see, okay, let's search for bear arms in the corpus, and we'll just count how many times this appears, and that gives us the answer. And that's really not how this works. We had a fairly elaborate methodology. And in fact, we have certain best practices that we suggest others do when they're doing corpus searches. So one of those best practices is that James and I were not doing the coding. And as far as we can tell, I think we're one of the first legal scholars to actually approach this, right? Most legal scholars who do corpus works simply go through the results themselves and code. And there are problems with that, right? When you're coding your own research, there are biases that seep in, right? We're all human, right? We're all fallible. None of us are perfect. No matter how hard you try to be objective, you're not. So when you have what's called double-blind coding, it eliminates the risk of biases. And the way this works is we had law students, just like all you, at various law schools who volunteered to do work for us. And initially we had 2 students operating independently of each other, coding these various queries along several dimensions. Is it collective, individual, different categories? If we found that 2 students tended to agree with each other within a certain degree, then we were, okay, that's fine. Then this is a fairly easy query, and we can just go with 2. But if we found that there were 2 students who diverged a lot, then we can throw a 3rd student, or maybe even a 4th student, right? The bigger the sort of disagreement was, it shows that the human mind might read the same sentence in different regards. And this allowed us, we think, to decrease the risk of bias. And again, we're all human. I don't say this as a pejorative, but the more people you have coding, or not sure the more, but when you have more people coding, if you have too many, it's also problematic. But when you have more people coding, you reduce the risk that other factors are seeping in. All right. I'm going to turn over to James in just a moment, but I wanted to give you the highlight of the queries performed. We did 5 queries in our paper. The first query was right of the people. The second query was keep and bear arms. And we also use synonyms of keep and bear arms. For example, keeping, bearing, carrying. We looked at various synonyms as well. Third, we queried the word right within 6 words of the word arms. That is, if you have a sentence and you have the word right within 6 words of arms, what do we get? 4, we query the word keep, as well as variants of keep, like keeping, kept, etc., within 6 words of arms. So again, we want to see how is keep and arms similar. 5th, we queried the word bear and variants of bear, like bearing, bared, bore, within 6 words of arms. And again, we use 8 coders with a double-blind methodology that we think should be the gold standard, or at least something close to the gold standard of how to go about doing corpus research. Let me just give a preview of our conclusion. On balance, a corpus linguistics analysis shows that the meaning of the Second Amendment is a closer call than either Heller's majority or dissent were willing to admit. We found linguistic evidence to support both views, but I can't say this enough because no one ever listens to this part of our presentation. Heller relied on far more than just linguistic evidence, right? We don't consider the other historical methodologies that inform the original public meaning of the Second Amendment. And again, we don't look at the 14th Amendment with incorporation, and we don't consider the right to carry outside the home, but that was simply beyond the scope of our work. All right, I'll shut up here. Happy to turn to my good friend James, and I welcome all of your questions later. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Josh. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and I'm going to get into some weeds on some of the issues that Josh hit. Okay, I hope you can all see that. I'm going to try to hit play here so that it's bigger.
Yep, looks good to me. I can see it, James.
Okay, great. So first off, I want to drill in a little bit to the interpretive premise that the Heller majority and seemingly Stephen's dissent were looking at. And so they said that the Constitution was written to be understood by the voters according to the normal and ordinary meaning, including idiomatic meaning, and that excludes meanings that would not have been known to ordinary citizens in the founding generation. You'll notice that there's a little tension here between being understood by voters versus understood by ordinary citizens, because not every citizen in the founding era could vote. And so there's a little bit of some theoretical imprecision here on what exactly we're looking at, because those are what linguists would call different speech communities, overlapping for sure, and certainly one would be subsumed in the other. But one is a broader speech community. And so that's something that theoretically originalism needs to grapple with a little bit. So Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens used relatively similar methodological approaches to try to get at their linguistic questions. In looking at right of the people, they both used what Killamar has called intratextualism. It's where you look at how, when you have a term that's used multiple times in a legal document, you try to see how it was used in other instances, what sense was used, what its meaning was, to shed light on the one that your particular instance you're looking at. For keep arms, Justice Scalia looked at a dictionary and 3 legal sources, which is actually pretty interesting because it's not clear that ordinary citizens or normal meaning would be reflected in legal sources, because as we all know, there's ordinary meaning and there's legal meaning or legal terms of art. Justice Stevens just kind of made the argument that the term was a unitary single right, didn't necessarily turn to any sources on that. And then for bear arms, they looked at a host of things, dictionaries again, etymology, and various legal documents and court decisions, as well as Justice Stevens looked at some more ordinary documents such as newspapers and letters. And Justice Scalia made the claim that bear arms only took its military meaning when it was followed by the word against. And so we're going to look at that, as well as Justice Stevens' claim that keep and bear arms was a unitary single right, a kind of term of art. All right, so there's some shortcomings with the Heller linguistic analysis, but to be fair to Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens, they were doing pretty traditional methodology for originalism and for this type of analysis. As Professor Blackman pointed out, they didn't have a corpus at that time. So founding era dictionaries are problematic. There is the issue of compositionality when you're looking at phrases. The sum of what a phrase means can be more or less than the sum of its linguistic parts. And the Supreme Court recognized this in 1920 with what's called the Anti-Dissection Rule. And this was in the area of trademark, actually, where they, Judge Easterbrook on the Seventh Circuit has a very great example of this. He says, take the term cut the mustard, look up mustard in the dictionary, and you're not going to have a clue on what cut the mustard means. And so you can't just dissect a phrase, look at its constituent parts in the dictionary, and necessarily understand how that phrase is used as a whole. Dictionaries are also a museum of words, right? They tell us what the possible meanings are of a word, but not what the probable meaning is in a given context. They also, founding era dictionaries also engaged in what's called Lexiographical Prescriptivism, and there was a tendency until the 1960s for dictionaries, especially American dictionaries, to tell you what the proper meaning was rather than how it was actually used. And it wasn't until Webster's Third really broke with that tradition and said, we're just going to define words on how they're used, not necessarily what their proper meaning is, that began to change. We also see that people who write dictionaries, lexicographers, tend to either be lumpers or splitters. Lumpers will tend to take a lot of nuanced senses and combine them all into one sense or definition, whereas splitters will break out these various nuances into different senses or definitions. Another problem is lexicographical piracy, where they tended to copy each other. And so what looks like a consensus on the meaning of a word in the founding era is really just copying, plagiarism. We also get the problem of idiosyncrasies because these dictionary writers, and I have Samuel Johnson, a picture of him up there, were written generally by one person. And so their linguistic idiosyncrasies would creep into the text. Finally, we have problems of time frame and linguistic drift. So because dictionary writers would copy each other, a dictionary, Noah Webster's dictionary in 1828, which is often turned to by originalists, was copying from Samuel Johnson's dictionary from 1765, which was copying a lot from a earlier English dictionary from the 1720s. So while a dictionary may have been published in the 1820s, it may have been using definitions based off of copying from the 1720s, which is too early. And then we see that over time, of course, meanings can change, and dictionaries don't always capture that. So there are limitations. I love dictionaries. It's not that they don't have some use, but there are serious limitations. Etymology is looking at the Latin roots of a word. Sorry, didn't mean to go to the next page here. And etymology is problematic because meanings the English meaning can have a different meaning than it would have had in its Latin roots. Take December, right? That would be the 10th month. Or an anthology would be a bouquet of flowers. And so etymology has its limitations. Also, you'll notice that they're looking at a few dictionaries or a few newspapers, and that's just an insufficient number of observations. If you're trying to say how the American people in 1789 or 91 or whatever your time period is would understand something. We would never, take a survey of a handful of people today and say, oh, well, we now know how what a public is. And so that's another problem. And finally, as we saw, they're mixing different publics and different speech communities and different sources. So, looking at legal sources to say how an ordinary person would understand a term is problematic. So that's where corpus linguistics comes in. Josh gave you a little bit of preview of that. That's just basically the empirical study of language patterns using corpora of naturally occurring texts. And it's just based on the principle the best way to find out how people understand language is to find out how people actually use language. And I've got a clip here from The Princess Bride. Let me see if I can get this to work here.
Perfect clip.
We didn't fall? Inconceivable. The videos in that one. It doesn't seem to me as what you think it means.
So, I can't remember the names very well of those characters, but the shorter bald guy was using the term in a way that the Spaniard there was saying was idiosyncratic. Really, that's not. He didn't think he was using it properly. We could conduct, or we could create a corpus of, I can't remember, Florian. I don't remember the society there, language. And we could see whether inconceivable was used more in that sense or in the other sense. So that's the great thing about corpus linguistics. And as Josh pointed out, let's see here, I got to get to the next slide. We all use corpus linguistics without realizing it. Modern dictionaries are created using corpus linguistics. In fact, there's an interesting movie called, I think it's The Professor and the Madman with Mel Gibson and Sean Penn that talks about the creation of the first Oxford English Dictionary, and they had a very primitive corpus. They would get in slips of paper of uses of various words from all over the country, and then they would put them in these little cubby holes, based on which word they were referring to, and from that they were developing the dictionary and the definitions. But your cell phones, when you're texting and it predicts the next word, it's actually using a corpus linguistic tool to do that. And Google and Westlaw are a non-linguistic type of corpus. So a few tools that I just want to highlight that Josh hit on. One is Concordance Lines, and I have a screenshot of that. And this probably doesn't look that much different than if you did a search in Westlaw and got a bunch of results. It just shows the word that you're searching in centered, and you can click on that and you can get greater context. And so I think this is really the meat and potatoes, where you're going into the context and looking how a word is used. Another somewhat helpful tool is called Collocation. And I think of this as word neighbors. Words tend to appear closer in use to some words than others. So for example, we don't generally see the word dark appear in the same context as the word perfume. Instead, we see dark appear in context with things like night, but perfume we don't, because that's just not, we don't use those two words together. And there's a similar concept of this in the law, noster associis. A thing is known by its associates. The law has recognized what linguists also recognize. And our brains work like this as well, actually. So let me give you an example. My wife and I were expecting a child, and we received a card from a friend, and in it, the friend congratulated us on the impending birth of our child. My wife read that and she said, impending birth? Doesn't impending go with bad things? And so I did some search in the corpus of modern American English, contemporary American English, and found, sure enough, she's right. The collocates of impending are things like doom, death, disaster, crisis, loss, danger, marriage. Not sure what's going on there. But you can see that it's associated with negative things. And so her brain had done collocate analysis. All right, so Josh introduced COFIA. COFIA really has three subparts to it that map onto different theories of originalism. So there's the kind of a mini subcorpus of the Evans or the American Imprint series. There's about a third of COFIA. And that's things like books, pamphlets, broadside speeches that come from mostly quote unquote ordinary folks. Now, the reality is, if you're illiterate and if you're poor, your stuff probably doesn't get into a corpus 250 years later. And that's just the way historical documents are. Then there's the founders' papers that includes letters and diaries from some of the more famous founders, as well as some letters written to them by quote unquote ordinary citizens. And then finally, there's a legal corpus from Hein Online which had various legal documents from the time period. All right, so Josh talked about this a little bit, but whenever you're trying to do this kind of research, you want to have both validity and reliability. Validity meaning accuracy, reliability meaning other people can replicate it. And so we, as Josh pointed out, had others do the coding or the classifying, where they would read an instance of a term and its context and try to classify or code which sense it belonged to. And we told these coders that we don't care what you find. We just want you to try to be as accurate as possible. We didn't want them to be biased by our own preconceptions of what might be found. And by doing it this way, we prevent our own biases from creeping in and influencing the coding, as well as getting a bit of a consensus and transparency as well by disclosing what we found. Okay, so Josh talked about keep and bear arms. Was it a term of art, as Justice Stevens thought it was? So, or as we might say in the law, a legal doublet. Linguists would call this a binomial. And so we looked first off in the corpus of early and modern American English, which was mostly British English from 1475 to 1800, to see if there was some kind of historical pedigree of this term. And we never found it once. And we looked at various what are called lemmas for kept or keeping, and synonyms, possess, and so we just couldn't find it. We looked in Kothia, and we found the term twice, and so this kind of tells us that this has not become a term of art. Keep and bear arms was not just used together like it was in the Second Amendment. So that's, in any case, Justice Stevens was just plain wrong on that linguistic conclusion. Now I want to get into some of these charts here, and so let's look at right of the people. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and on this, and I'm going to show you right from our paper. Here we go. So hopefully you can see that. So there's where we looked at right of the people in Kothia. And we found that there was a bit of a majority sense in that over half the time our coders thought that right of the people tended to refer to a collective right, whereas around a quarter, roughly, give or take, of the time, it would refer to an individual right, and then there's a bit of a range on it also referring to both a collective and an individual right. And, this isn't surprising because right of the people is something that comes out of the Declaration of Independence and often referred to self-governance, that a collective right would appear so frequently. But it raises a question of when we're trying to figure out what the ordinary meaning of something is, how much does one sense have to dominate others in order to be ordinary meaning? Is a little over 50% sufficient? Do we want something closer to like 80 or 90% in order to say that's the ordinary meaning? And that's a theoretical question that originalism hasn't really answered as we've made these methodological improvements. So again, right of the people tended to be used more in a collective sense, but certainly a fair minority of the time, individual or both senses were invoked. And then I next want to show here the sense distribution for right within 6 words of arms. And so really we felt like this was the most relevant context. And this is the beauty of corpus linguistics. You can drill down on certain contexts. And so the Second Amendment is about discussing arms in the context of rights. And so we wanted to see how other folks were referring to arms in the context of rights. And what we found was really interesting is that there is no dominant sense. Roughly a third of the time, maybe slightly more, arms was used in a military or collective sense. A quarter to a third of the time, it's used in an individual sense. A quarter of the time, it's referring to both. And then a little bit of the time, it was ambiguous and our coders couldn't figure out which category to put it in. And because this is arguably the most relevant evidence, it seems to indicate that the ordinary person of the founding era probably would have understood the use of arms in the Second Amendment to really refer to both an individual and a military or collective sense. Now, there's a caution to our findings, and you'll notice that our sample sizes we only found 46 instances of this in the entire database, and that's a little bit on the small side. So there's some caution to our finding here, but it does point towards an understanding that both of those senses would have been used in the Second Amendment, or understood in the Second Amendment. Then we wanted to see, what about keep within 6 words of arms, and the lemma of keep. So we had keeping and kept, keeps. And here we did a little bit different kind of analysis, because you can keep arms for different reasons. You can keep them for individual use. You can keep them for more of a collective military use. And so we had our coders look at what type of keeping it was. Is this an individual keeping it? Is this a collective, like an armory that the town was keeping them? And then what were they being kept to use for? And as you can see, about a quarter of the time, roughly, this was referred to collective keeping and collective using. So this is the armory in the town, right? About half the time, it was an individual keeping it for collective use. So that could be for going to serve in the militia. About a quarter of the time, was an individual keeping for individual use. So this could be hunting or self-defense, something like that. And never, ever was it for collective keeping for an individual use, where you had to go check out the gun from the armory in order to go hunting or something like that. Which is really interesting, because there was a book that won, was it the Pulitzer Prize or no, some history prize, Josh?
It was the, I'll look it up 1 second.
It won some major prize, some historical book that made this very argument that the history showed that it was a collective keeping for individual use.
Oh, it was the Bancroft Prize.
Okay, the Bancroft Prize.
Very prestigious.
Yeah, the biggest prize you can win as an American historian. And later we found out, or it came to light that the guy had falsified his sources, and the prize was revoked. But it's interesting that our research shows that he was wrong. So again, we see that there's quite a bit of different use here in the data. And then finally, the last one. Remember, Justice Scalia says bear arms only took on the military sense when it was followed by the term against. So we get a random sample of 100 of bear and any lemma of bear within 6 words of arms. And we found that Justice Scalia was wrong on this particular point, and that the collective or militia sense of bearing arms was the overwhelmingly predominant sense here. That an individual, it is possible to use the term bear arms in an individual sense. A great example of this is the Pennsylvania minority, submitted some proposed amendments to the Constitution, and they talked about bearing arms for hunting, right? So that sense is possible, but it is a very minority sense here, and it doesn't require it to follow bear arms to have the word against, to bear arms against the king or something to take on that sense. So on that particular point, Justice Scalia was wrong. So again, as Josh said, this is a much closer call than I think either side was willing to indicate. Both Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens made at least one linguistic mistake, or one of their conclusions was wrong. Does that necessarily mean that either of them, their conclusions was wrong? Not necessarily. I think they could both, recover from those errors and still make an argument why their side was right. But again, we see that it is a little bit more complex than they were willing to admit. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Josh for any closing thoughts.
Sure. So let me just give a general observation on how corpus linguistics is often misused. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Far too often, people sort of, have their mind made up on a case, right? And they know Scalia was right, or they know Stevens was wrong. And they want research that simply backs up their position. And this is common in virtually every walk of life, right? Where you want to find some authority that sort of supports your position. And what I advise everyone when you do corpus linguistics, try very hard to go into it with an open mind. James and I truly had an open mind. We never really talked about our views on gun control. We never really talked about what our views were on these sort of social issues. We were legitimately curious in this issue, right? We both, James is like a giant. I'm just like a little dwarf, but he's been doing corpus linguistics for years. He's the man, right? But I've been doing research on originalism for a long time, and I was genuinely curious. We have this new database that just come out a couple years ago. We have this ginormous case called Heller that's like this bellwether for originalism, and we wanted to see was Scalia right or wrong. We did not have a conception going, was he right or wrong? We didn't have an answer in mind. And some of the results, frankly, James agreed, were surprising. It was like, wow, we did not see that coming. Other results were, okay, that's about what we expect. And others were, wow, they both screwed up, right? So you really need to do this sort of research with an open mind. And that's where I'm a huge fan of this sort of double-blind coding, precisely because it eliminates these sort of preconceived notions, what you might call behavioral biases, so to speak. But I'm really grateful for the chance to present here. Hopefully people were following along. It's a little dense at times. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Give everybody a round of applause.
By the way, how many people in the room? I can't quite see, just my own knowledge.
So we're a small chapter, but we have 11 in the room today.
Okay, thank you.
We're going from, we're trying to build it back up. We were really, really small.
That's okay. That's quite all right. All right, so any questions from the room, please?
I think, so I have one to get it started, and I think we'll have people come up just around it as they have to. And this kind of goes off the last point that you just made, Professor Blackman. I know at the end of the article you talked about like the goal that hopefully both practitioners and then academics, but also judges and clerks should start hopefully using corpus linguistics as a more common method. And so I guess my question is, how best could people go about in a judicial setting? How best could the double blind be accomplished when you have such a small staff to begin with?
Sure, I'll start, and maybe James can come later. So I also wrote an article called "Originalism in the Lower Courts." It was published in the NYU Journal of Law and Liberty about 2 years ago. And one of the issues I address is, how can judges be originalists given that they have limited staff, right? They have limited, they have maybe 3, maybe 4 law clerks, depending on chambers, and they have times, they have constraints, their docket is busy. And moreover, it's risky when judges sort of do their own research because they're not being checked. In an ideal world, litigants are doing corpus linguistics research. James is an attorney. He's done these sorts of things in his briefs before. And if you're a judge and you want to have a question of original meaning and the parties aren't giving you what you want, you can ask them to do more briefing. As Mel Brooks said, it's good to be a king, right? It's good to be a judge. And you can ask them to do a briefing on corpus linguistics, which might not even be helpful. There was a case by Judge Tapar in the Sixth Circuit about maybe 2 years ago now on, was it habeas corpus, James? I think it was on habeas. And Tapar asked, or maybe it was on Article 3, something Fed Courts issue. And Tapar asked for the questions, and after research, it's like, okay, that doesn't really help our inquiry, which is fine, right? It's useful to know that corpus linguistics it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to answer all your questions. But Blake, to respond to your question, ask the parties, put adversarial process, let them put their research out there, and then as a judge, you can assess, and that's the best way.
Well, I agree with that. I think asking for supplemental briefing, if the parties don't brief it initially, is probably the best route. Now, that being said, I think it's possible for a judge to do this, depending on if they've had a little bit of training in this. And there actually is yearly training for judges on corpus linguistics. And how I would recommend they go about doing it is that they would assign 2 different clerks to do the analysis, and ask that the clerks not discuss it with each other, and kind of do it on their own, and then bring it to the judge to kind of see, to the extent they agree in what they found. A judge that would have to be extra careful to try not to bias his clerks by saying, I'm 100% sure Stevens was right. Go do the analysis and prove me right, right? You don't want that. You want, hey, let's see what we find. I have no idea what we're going to find. I have no idea who's right. I want you to independently do this. And so it's possible for a judge to do that, but I think it is better that they ask for the parties to do it than do it themselves. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you both so much. That was just that was one thing I was curious about towards the end of the article, so I appreciate that too. Our next question, I think, is from Isaiah McKinney, who's our 3L rep.
Oh, I met him. I met him in the Federal Convention last week. Good to see you again.
Josh, it's a pleasure to see you again as well. You guys mentioned that there were errors made on both sides, of both Stevens and Scalia. After having analyzed both of their arguments, did either of them do a better job than the other? Was there a winner, more or less? Or did you just see, or were there errors both kind of weigh each other out?
James, you want to do this one?
Well, we did give them grades. I guess we could have calculated a GPA. I'd have to think about whether one did better or the other. I will say this though, after looking at the data myself, at what our coders found, and I also actually initially did some of the coding just to I think it's a good idea for a researcher to kind of get their feet into it as well and get before they shift it off to the coders, because you kind of have to also train them a little bit on what are the categories. And my feeling is that I lean towards Scalia being correct overall. And it's interesting, there's two things that push me there. One is the one thing that I highlighted, that in the context that is most relevant, when we're talking about arms in the context of right, both a collective and an individual sense were used about the same, as well as both of the senses together. So I think that people would have understood the right to protect both the right to serve in the militia, to have arms to be able to go serve in the militia, but also to have arms to go hunt and self-defense and all of that. The other thing that pushes me towards the Scalia position is the dog that didn't bark. And that's from a famous Sherlock Holmes story about a dog that didn't bark when a horse was stolen, and it helped Sherlock Holmes realize that the dog knew the person who came, because that's why he didn't bark. The dog that didn't bark here is that the Anti-Federalists were not up in arms, pun intended, over the Second Amendment. Because if it meant that they were not protected for self-defense, for hunting, for all the things that they needed guns for to survive, set aside serving the militia, I think they really would have had a collective cow. And we don't see any of that. We don't see any criticism of the Second Amendment on those grounds by the Anti-Federalists. And that, to me, seems to indicate that they thought that it also protected their right to have a gun in their house and go shoot a bear if it's attacking them, or go get a deer, or if they're having problems with the Native Americans or their neighbor or whatever. So those two pieces of evidence push me towards the Scalia view.
Yeah, I mean, look, I stress this point at the outset that the Corpus Linguistics was only a fairly small part of Heller. I mean, Heller was 100 and something page decision. The linguistics claims take up maybe 2 or 3 pages, James, maybe 4 pages. I mean, we're not talking a significant portion. We're talking a couple of pages of 100-odd page opinion. So on balance, I'm still with Scalia. I think the bulk of historical evidence supports it. But I recognize that when you undermine parts of an opinion, it does weaken the whole, right? And we have to be candid to recognize that Scalia's opinion was not like unassailable, right? You can poke holes in it. I think in balance, still, if you start poking holes in Scalia and Stevens, Scalia still afloats, Stevens sinks quicker. But we have to be honest, and that doesn't mean you overrule Heller. That's not even an issue this term. But we should at least be candid about what was going on.
I will add one additional thought that is kind of interesting. So as I recall, and Josh knows Heller much better than I do, I think everybody in the opinion agreed that a prefatory clause could be useful to determine to help if there's ambiguity with the operative clause. And I think Scalia took the position that the operative clause is not ambiguous, therefore, prefatory clause isn't triggered, if I recall correctly. Our research seems to indicate that it's a little bit closer to ambiguous than Scalia was willing to admit, which calls into question whether or not that it's close enough to trigger the prefatory clause and make an argument that this should be read as only a militia context. I still think if we're just going with how ordinary people would have understood the Second Amendment, it would have been that they would have thought both rights were triggered. But our findings do make that debate over when the prefatory clause is triggered and the level of ambiguity a little bit more salient than maybe Scalia was willing to admit.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Agreed. What other questions you have?
So going through the law school note and comment process, are there any other topics that would be relevant and suitable for this or potential follow-ups on Heller?
Oh, what a good question. James, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I guess I haven't thought about that. There are certainly other scholarship out there that we critique a little bit that uses corpus linguistics to get at the Second Amendment. I mean,
well, maybe I can give a thought. We don't look at the 14th Amendment history. James, when is the Reconstruction Corpus coming out? Is it out already, or is it coming? Or what's the?
It's in process as far as I understand, but that's a great point. You could certainly look at the meaning of these terms in the late 1860s.
Yeah, there's the good people at BYU. They're doing a database in the Reconstruction era, which is taking its time. But that could also be useful. What else is sort of fecund grounds for scholarship on corpus linguistics? One area that may be useful is on I know this is not silly, but Article 3 jurisdiction, like cases and controversy, judicial power. I mean, that's something that might benefit from a corpus search. I haven't given too much thought, but the original meaning of jurisdiction is starting to get a little more traction with cases like Spokio and FTC versus Ramirez. What are cases and controversies in judicial context? That might be hard, but that's just a thought.
Yeah, and let me throw this out. So a corpus analysis is really good when you have competing senses of a term. It's not as great when we're trying to figure out behavior. So, for example, what role does stare decisis have at the founding? Doing a search of stare decisis isn't going to help you out. Really, what you want to see what judges were doing, and so in that sense, a corpus linguistics type search wouldn't be helpful. But if we're debating over the meaning of a term in the Constitution and there's competing senses, then it can be very helpful. And I'll throw a couple of for ideas for folks. So we have the privileges and immunities clause, which is not. I'm not talking about the 14th Amendment's privileges or immunity clause, but privileges and immunities. And if you do a search of the reverse, immunities and privileges, before the Constitution is adopted, it's twice as common. So is there a difference there? That might be some interesting research on that. Does the order matter? So I think there's lots of things that this tool could be used for in the Second Amendment context. I think the most likely would be kind of reconstruction analysis of the terms. You could certainly email David Armand at BYU, who's kind of overseeing that corpus, and see if he knows when it's going to be publicly available, but I don't know.
Thank you both for that too. We had one question. This is kind of, I think, something we were discussing before the meeting today as a board, and also just it kind of came up at the law review this year. How do you respond to those that just dismiss corpus linguistics as pure bean counting? I mean, what are the best ways?
Dismiss it for being what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear this.
Pure bean counting, or just
bean counting,
or like I had one professor email me. This is just libertarian policy in disguise. How do you like? And I had my responses, but I also wanted to know how you would have responding to
Oh,
it yourself.
my
So
goodness, does he realize we criticize Scalia? I mean, we say that on page 1 of our article.
he does, and I don't think I don't think that mattered as much. But that's just that was one outlier. But I was just curious.
Oh, man.
I know how we handled it, but I was wanting to know how both of you would handle that as well, to try to win people over on maybe seeing beyond just their one view.
Okay. I mean, look, and I think I can answer this question two levels. So one, there's some academics and lawyers who simply reject formalism in all its regards, right? They believe sincerely that the law is a myth, that there is no structure, that law and politics are one, critical studies, whatever label you want to use, right? For people like that, they don't care corpus linguistics from Santa Claus, right? It doesn't matter. It's all just some sort of mythical stuff. And I think with them, the debate is not over corpus linguistics, but is there actually law, right? It's actually a far more basic, foundational debate. But then there are people who are more open to the idea that there's some form to law. And I think it's useful when you show people who agree with Heller, like James and me, are still willing to identify deficiencies in Heller, given corpus linguistics, right? We've taken a lot of friendly fire, so to speak, from people on the right saying, what are you guys doing, you idiots? Don't do this. Don't make Scalia look bad. I talked to one Scalia clerk that was kind of it's like, oh, Scalia got it right. You guys, So I think originalism in corpus can show that this is not purely some sort of libertarian fantasy, right? So that's the first criticism. The bean counting one, my goodness, read our paper. We have page upon page of our methodology, right? I give James most of the credit. I'm just sort of tagging along, but we put an absurd amount of thought into how to structure this to make it fair and not as little bias as possible. We really this took us nearly 2 years to finish. This is not like a paper written in 5 minutes, right? It took us a lot of time. We put a lot of thought on how to structure our queries. We hired an entire team of researchers to separate from us. And I challenge anyone, just read the introduction of our paper. It's a long paper. Just read the intro, a few pages. This ain't bean counting. James, how do you address this sort of criticism? Maybe you have a better answer than me.
Well, I don't know if I have a better answer, but just some additional thoughts. So on the bean counting, I would concede that corpus linguistics could be improperly used in a type of bean counting way. But any tool can be misused. Dictionaries can be misused. And in fact, some people kind of do bean counting with dictionaries, where they count up how many times their preferred definition is found. And so, yeah, it can be misused in that way. But if you're using it properly, if you're narrowing it to the correct context, then it can be a powerful tool, which leads, I think, into another issue, and that is originalism requires a certain methodology, because its theory says we want to know how a certain group of people understood these words. And corpus linguistics is the only way to get at that. At least it's a better way to do it than dictionaries. Now, if we could go back in time and survey people, maybe that would be superior, although there's issues with surveys. But this is all we've got. And so I kind of think of, Winston Churchill's comment that, a democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. Corpus linguistics is the best of what we've got to answer the question that originalism asks. And so, if you don't like the question originalism asks, you're probably not going to like corpus linguistics. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that corpus linguistics has the potential to do that is a critique of originalism and textualism is that the critique is that it's just a conservative thing. It's just a way to get conservative outcomes and have some veneer of objectivity. Well, corpus linguistics is just data, and we don't always know what the data is going to show. And so it's not conservative, it's not liberal, it just is. And you don't know what you're going to find. And so that can, I think, actually protect originalism a little bit by showing, if people are willing to follow the data, that it's not necessarily conservative or liberal.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for your time today. I think there's another professor trying to come in, I think, for a class.
Well, you tell him there's a
right after ours.
libertarian fence and he has to wait.
No, hey, just to be clear, those were not certainly not my critiques.
That's okay.
I just wanted to.
I'm having fun. I've actually never been to Wake Forest. Hope to visit you all in the future at some point. I've never actually been to the campus. Hopefully, I'll be able to see you all in the future.
We would love to have you here in person. Absolutely, both of you. And so this has been an incredible day. And thank you again both for one, I guess, just from a law review perspective for choosing us, and for two, for being willing to speak to our chapter today.
Thank you for choosing us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Have a wonderful day. James, see you later, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.